The scorch mark on the Panther's glacis is fresh, a black smear where an American 75mm round skated off the armor at first light and went spinning into a hedgerow. Unteroffizier Karl Reinhardt sees it every time he leans out of his hatch. He put that mark there himself, or rather the Sherman across the wheat did, before he answered it. One shot. He saw the American tank stop, saw the smoke boil out of the engine deck as two crewmen crawled clear and dragged a third into the ditch. Near Mons, on a September morning in 1944, Reinhardt does what any competent gunner does after a confirmed kill. He crosses it off. He turns the turret toward the next threat and forgets the burning shape behind him. By dusk, that same Sherman is shooting at him. Not a different Sherman. The same one, same ditch, same scorched flank, same white star half hidden under road grime. Reinhardt can see the exact spot where his round scored the hull. And that is the thing he cannot file away, the thing that will sit in his chest long after the fighting near Mons goes quiet. A tank he killed at breakfast is killing his platoon at supper, and nothing in his training accounts for it. That shouldn't be possible. A knocked-out tank stays knocked out. That was the whole arithmetic of armored war, as the Germans understood it. You traded steel for steel, and a dead machine was a permanent subtraction. That arithmetic is what this channel exists to take apart. So if the way one side counted its kills and the other side refused to stay dead is the kind of thing you want more of, like this video, subscribe, and put your family's stories in the comments. Because the men who lived this are the reason any of it survives at all. Here is what Reinhardt didn't know, standing in his cupola, trying to make the math work. The German army built tanks to win engagements. The American army built tanks to win the day after the engagement. Those are different machines even when they look similar through a gun sight. A Panther that took a penetrating hit usually went to a rear depot, if it moved at all, and the depot was often 200 kilometers back and short of parts. A Sherman that took a hit went to whichever GI with a wrench got to it first. Sometimes that GI was still bleeding from the same shell. The man who climbed back into that Mons Sherman was not a fresh crew. Sources on the exact unit are thin, and I'm not going to pretend the muster roll is sitting in front of me. It isn't. What the maintenance culture of the American armored divisions makes clear is the pattern, and the pattern is almost boring in its consistency. The engine deck that Reinhardt saw smoking was not the fuel tank going up. It was very likely the power plant venting after a round, clipped the rear, ugly but survivable. A German gunner reading that plume as a death is a reasonable German gunner. He is also, on this particular evening, a wrong one. I find the German confidence here almost sympathetic. Reinhardt did everything right. He acquired, he fired, he hit, he confirmed, he moved on. Every step was textbook, and the textbook was good. The Wehrmacht wrote the sharpest armor doctrine of the early war. The flaw wasn't in his gunnery. The flaw was upstream, in an assumption nobody in his chain of command ever thought to question, because in their world it was simply true. The Americans had quietly stopped playing by that rule. They had turned the recovery of wounded tanks into something closer to an industry than a battlefield improvisation. And the man at the center of this particular story, the mechanic who patched a Sherman under fire and then climbed into the gunner's seat to settle a personal account, is the sharpest example I've found of what that industry looked like at the level of one furious human being. To understand how a dead tank starts shooting back, we have to go back to before it died. Back to the morning, and the round, and the man in the ditch who decided the fight wasn't over. A German tank kill got written down in a small field book, in pencil, with a date and a rough type. Panther, T-34 type, or Sherman, brewed up. That book mattered. Kill counts fed the Knight's Cross, the mention in dispatches, the office's reputation that traveled up the chain faster than any after-action report. Michael Wittmann became a household name in the Reich because of a number, and the number was tanks destroyed. The whole incentive structure of the German armored force pointed one direction. The moment of the kill, the flash on the enemy hull, the confirmed subtraction. What happened to that enemy hull afterward was somebody else's problem, and in the German system, it was nobody's problem, because a killed tank was assumed to be gone. Panthers and tigers and the beautiful lethality of German optics leave one thing out of the lesson. The German gunner was rewarded for the flash. The American mechanic was rewarded for the recovery. Two armies looking at the same burning Sherman and counting it in opposite columns. Watch how the bookkeeping actually worked on the American side, because it's stranger than the combat. Each U.S. armored division rolled with an ordnance maintenance battalion, and behind that, Sat Corps and Army-level heavy maintenance, and behind that, the depots. A Sherman that stopped moving entered a pipeline. Recovery crews with M32 tank retrievers, a Sherman hull with the turret pulled off and a boom and winch bolted on, went out under fire to drag the wrecks home. The winch pulled 40,000 pounds. That's roughly the weight of the tank it was hauling, which is the point. They designed the recovery vehicle around the assumption that they would be recovering constantly as a matter of routine, not emergency. The numbers are almost comic when you set them side by side. American ordnance studies after the war found that a large fraction of Shermans knocked out in combat were repaired and returned to service, many of them more than once. The same physical tank, hit, dragged back, welded, recrewed, sent forward. A German after-action count that logged one Sherman destroyed was, in the American ledger, logging one Sherman temporarily inconvenienced. The steel didn't leave the battlefield. It went to a field near the battlefield, sat under a mechanic's droplight for a night, and came back. I keep coming back to the smell of those recovery fields because the memoirs do. Cutting oil and burnt cordite, and the sweet chemical stink of a welding arc going all night. Acetylene torches throwing blue light across canvas. The clang of a sledge on a bogey wheel at 2 a.m. A GI standing in a ditch of engine oil up to his bootlaces, arguing with the transmission. This was the sound of the American way of war, and it was nothing like the recruiting posters. It was a machine shop that happened to be within artillery range. The Germans could not match this. It wasn't that German mechanics were worse. They were superb, often better trained on their individual vehicles than their American counterparts. It was arithmetic upstream of the wrench. The Panther used the same road wheel in an interleaved pattern that meant pulling one damaged inner wheel required removing several good ones first. Parts came from factories being flattened by American bombers. A German tank 200 kilometers from a depot with a cracked final drive was, functionally, a pillbox. The doctrine that produced the most lethal tank on the battlefield also produced a tank that, once wounded, tended to stay wounded. So the two systems diverged at the exact moment of the kill. Reinhardt fired, the Sherman stopped, and both armies agreed on what had just happened. They disagreed completely on what it meant. To the German, it was a permanent subtraction, a number for the field book, a threat removed. To the American ordnance system, it was a work order. The tank was not dead. It was in the shop. And somewhere in that pipeline near Mons, a mechanic was already moving toward the wreck with a toolbox, because in his army, the burning tank behind the line wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of his shift. In the fields around Mons, the 3rd Armored Division was bleeding steel faster than any American outfit in Europe, and its mechanics were the reason nobody in the line companies seemed to notice. Spearhead. That was the division's name, and it earned it by staying at the tip of First Army's advance for most of the campaign, which meant it took the first punch nearly everywhere it went. The number that survives is brutal in its plainness. The 3rd Armored Division was authorized 232 medium tanks. Over the course of the war in Europe, it lost, as total write-offs, something north of 630 Shermans, and it had many more knocked out and returned. Do that arithmetic slowly. The division destroyed its entire tank strength, more than 2.5 times over in write-offs alone, and that figure doesn't count the ones that came back. An outfit hemorrhaging armor at that rate should have ground to a halt inside a month. It didn't. That is the whole mystery of the thing, and the answer wasn't a factory in Detroit. It was a battalion of tired men with torque wrenches following the division everywhere it went. The unit doing the resurrecting was divisional ordnance, working alongside the maintenance sections, folded into each combat command. Their job description on paper was dry. 3rd and 4th echelon maintenance. In practice, their job was to make the German kill count a lie. A Sherman came in on the back of an M32 with its transmission cracked and its assistant driver dead, and the maintenance crew stripped the useful parts off a hull too far gone to save, welded a patch over the penetration, hosed out what the previous crew had left behind, and had it running by morning. They cannibalized wrecks the way a surgeon uses a donor. One dead Sherman could keep 3 wounded ones fighting. Belton Cooper watched this happen from the inside, and his account is the one everybody reaches for, because he was an ordnance liaison officer in exactly this division, and wrote it all down. He drove between the maintenance yards in the front, logging losses, and the picture he paints is not glory, it's exhaustion. He describes counting the morning's knocked-out tanks and feeling the arithmetic in his stomach, then watching the same crews turn those hulls back into runners on almost no sleep. He called the Sherman a death trap, and he meant it. He saw what an 88 did to the men inside, but he also documented in the same pages the machine that made the death trap survivable at the level of the division. You lost the tank. You did not lose the war, because tomorrow you had the tank again. The recruiting films never showed this part. The men doing this were not riflemen, and they were not celebrated. A maintenance sergeant who kept 40 tanks running got no medal for it, no field book entry, no mention in dispatches. His reward was more broken tanks. The German gunner who knocked out a Sherman near Mons got a confirmed kill that might feed a decoration. The American who put that Sherman back into the fight got a work order and a fresh pot of coffee that had been reheated 4 times. And it kept getting worse for the Germans in a way they could not see from the firing line. Every day Spearhead advanced, its supply of dead but recoverable hulls grew, because it was the side holding the ground where the wrecks lay. A retreating army leaves its knocked-out tanks to the enemy. An advancing one collects them. So the Third Armored's parts problem solved itself, precisely because it was winning ground. The battlefield itself became the depot. The division that lost the most tanks was also the division best positioned to raid its own graveyard. The Panther could not do this. When the Germans pulled back, their wounded tanks stayed where they died, and every one of them became American salvage or a smoking landmark. When the Americans pulled forward, their wounded tanks went into the shop and came out with a new patch weld and an old grudge, which brings us back to one specific hull, sitting in a ditch near Mons, with a scorch on its flank and a smashed sight. It was already on somebody's list, and the man walking toward it had a very personal reason to hurry. The wheat comes apart in front of the muzzle, stalks flattening in a ring, as the Panther's 75 throws around across the field at better than 3,000 feet per second. The mechanic, the records near Mons, give him no clean name, and I'm not going to invent one, is half in the gunner's seat with a wrench still in his hand. He has had the tank running for maybe 90 seconds. The engine is caught, the turret traverses, and then the world inside the fighting compartment turns white and loud. The round does exactly what German gunnery promised it would do. At that range, the long 75 on Reinhardt's Panther punches through the Sherman's side hull, like the armor is suggestion rather than protection. 3 inches of face-hardened steel, and the American plate on the flank is closer to 1.5. Nobody doubted the physics. A German gunner who put his sight on a Sherman side at 600 meters was going to get through, and every crewman in every Allied tank knew it. Here is the part the doctrine gets right, and the memoirs confirm. The penetration itself is almost surgical. A fist-sized hole punched clean, edges bright where the metal peeled. It is what comes after the hole that kills. A jet of molten steel and armor fragments, the spall, sprays the inside of the compartment at the speed of shrapnel. It does not care what it hits. Radios, ammunition racks, hydraulic lines, men. The mechanic takes fragments down one side. Not the killing wound the compartment was built to deliver, but enough. Enough to open his arm and his ribs and fill the space with the smell of hot metal and his own blood. He does not brew up. Everything turns on that. The nightmare of the Sherman was fire, the wet stowage debates, the reputation that trailed the tank like smoke. A penetrating hit into the ammunition, and the whole thing went up in seconds, which is what Reinhardt watched happen to the tank at breakfast and what he expected again now. But a round can pass through a Sherman and miss the propellant. It can wreck the interior, wound the crew, kill the gun's optics, and leave the vehicle mechanically intact. The tank stops, not because it is dead, but because the men inside it are hurt, and the sight is smashed. From 400 meters, through his own gun sight, Reinhardt reads the stopped tank the only way his training allows. Turret frozen. No return fire. A shape gone still in the wheat. Confirmed. The competence is real. He has, by every measure his army recognizes, killed this tank a second time. His confidence is earned. It is also again wrong, and he has no way of knowing it, because the difference between a dead Sherman and a wounded one is invisible from the firing line. It lives inside the compartment, in whether the man in the gunner's seat is still breathing. The man in the gunner's seat is still breathing. He is slumped against the turret ring with his side laid open, half blind from the flash, ears ringing so hard the engine sounds like it is underwater. The sight is destroyed. The radio is dead or close to it. By any reasonable accounting, he is out of the fight, and the smart move, the trained move that keeps you alive, is to get low and wait for dark and crawl back to the aid station. He does the other thing. The tank still runs. The gun still functions. A shattered primary sight does not stop a 75-millimeter gun from firing. It only makes aiming a matter of the backup and the naked eye, and the kind of close-range guesswork a mechanic who has stripped and rebuilt this exact weapon happens to be qualified to do. He knows the machine better than most gunners ever will, because he has had its guts spread on a tarp. He knows what it can still do with half its systems bleeding out. 400 meters away, Reinhardt has already turned his attention elsewhere, crossing the same tank off the same list for the second time in one day. He is about to learn what that costs. Belton Cooper drives up to the maintenance yard near Mons, with a clipboard full of the morning's dead, and what he finds there is a factory floor that has no walls and no roof and no rest. This is the machine the German gunner never sees. Reinhardt counts flashes on a distant hull and writes a number. Cooper counts hulls coming off the transporters and writes a different number, and his number keeps shrinking because his men keep turning wrecks back into runners faster than the enemy can make wrecks. The two ledgers never meet. One of them is winning. Watch the tempo, because tempo is the whole argument. A Sherman came into the yard on the back of an M32 with a hole in its flank and a fouled interior. A German crew looking at equivalent damage on a Panther was looking at a job measured in days, if the parts existed, if a depot was within reach, if the interleaved road wheels didn't have to come off in the exact reverse order. A design engineer in Kassel had blessed. The American crew measured the same job in hours. Pull the ruined assembly, bolt in a replacement lifted off a hull too far gone to save, weld a plate over the penetration, hose it out, test the engine, and move to the next one. Cooper watched crews do this through the night, on coffee and cigarettes, and the flat certainty that tomorrow there would be more. The reason wasn't heroism. It was engineering philosophy, decided years earlier by men who never touched a wrench in a wheat field. The Sherman was built to be worked on. Its powertrain came out the front as a unit. Its road wheels bolted on in a simple line, each one reachable without disturbing its neighbors. Parts were interchangeable across thousands of vehicles because the drawings were standardized and the factories were competing to hit tolerances, not artistry. The Panther was the better tank in a duel and the worst tank in a war, because a war is fought at the pace of your slowest repair. Here's what irritates me more than it probably should. The Germans knew. Their own maintenance officers filed reports complaining that the final drive on the Panther was failing at catastrophic rates, that the transmission couldn't take the torque, that the whole vehicle was a maintenance nightmare bolted around a magnificent gun. And the response from above was more Panthers, better guns, heavier armor, another wonder weapon on the drawing board. Nobody in that system got a decoration for making the tank easier to fix. Whitman got a Knight's Cross for kills. The engineer who might have redesigned the final drive to be swappable in the field got a memo telling him to stop complaining. A culture that worshipped the flash on the enemy hull could not, structurally, reward the man who kept its own tanks moving. And it lost partly because of that, which is a strange and specific way to lose a war. Anyway, the point is what all of this meant on the ground near Mons on this particular morning. The mechanic in the wounded Sherman didn't end up there by chance. The system produced him. He came out of the exact operation Cooper ran, the yards, the cannibalized hulls, the culture that treated a knocked-out tank as a work order rather than a headstone. He had spent weeks with the guts of these machines spread on tarps, learning where the spall goes and what still works after a penetration, and how to coax a fouled engine back to life with the sight smashed off its mount. His army had, without meaning to, trained the perfect man to sit in a half-dead tank and keep fighting, because his army trained thousands of men to see a half-dead tank as a thing that goes back to work. Cooper's records don't name him. I've looked at the shape of the account, and the file simply doesn't carry that name down to us, and I'm not going to manufacture one to make the story sit better. What the record does carry is the tempo. Tanks in at dusk, tanks out at dawn. The German kill count quietly falsified by a welding arc. 400 meters across the wheat. None of this exists for Reinhardt. He sees a dead tank. Behind that dead tank stands an entire industrial religion he will never be allowed to understand. The engine catches. A man who has rebuilt an engine 40 times can start it half blind, and that is exactly what he does. His good hand finds the switches by memory, the way you find a light in your own house at night. The Continental radial coughs, catches, and settles into that flat American drone, and the whole hull trembles under him, like something coming back to life against its own better judgment. The wheat outside is on fire in patches where the Panther's round grazed it, thin ribbons of smoke bending low across the field. He can't use the primary sight. It's gone, a smear of cracked glass and bent housing where a fragment took it. So he does the thing the manual never covers. He traverses by hand, cheek away from the ruined optic, lining the gun up along the naked barrel and the burn mark in the distance where he last saw the flash. Blood runs down inside his sleeve and pools in his glove. He works the traverse anyway. 400 meters. For a 75, that's nothing. That's point blank in the vocabulary of tank guns. Close enough that you barely lead. Close enough that the round arrives almost the instant you decide to send it. Reinhardt has moved on. His turret is turned away, hunting the next target in the tree line, because the tank in the wheat is dead. He killed it twice. The field book has the entry. The mechanic loads. One arm mostly working, he breaks around out of the ready rack, shoves it home, hears the breech close with that heavy machined clack he's heard 10,000 times on the workbench. He knows this sound better than his own voice. He knows the weight of the shell, and the throw of the breech, and the exact resistance of the firing mechanism. He lays the gun on the side of the Panther, the flank. Not the glacis that shrugged off the morning shot, not the mantelet, and not the thick sloped front that made the Panther the terror of every field it sat in. The side, where the German plate is thin, the same way the Sherman's is thin, because no tank is armored everywhere, and a man who has patched penetrations for weeks knows precisely where steel stops being a wall. He fires. The recoil throws the breech back past his wounded side, and the compartment fills with smoke and the stink of cordite and hot brass. The round crosses 400 meters of burning wheat in under half a second and goes into the Panther's flank, where the crew and the ammunition and the fuel all sit. The Panther brews up. That word again. The one the Germans used for Shermans. The one Reinhardt wrote in pencil about the tank at breakfast. Now it belongs to him. The turret lifts on a column of flame, that specific catastrophic flash of propellant going all at once, and the tank that killed the same Sherman twice in one morning becomes a black smear on the same field. Whatever Reinhardt understood in that last quarter second, the record does not say. Nobody was taking notes inside that turret. The mechanic sits in the smoke of his own gun, with his arm ruined and his ears gone, and watches the thing burn. He does not celebrate. There's no evidence he does anything but slump back against the turret ring and wait, because that is what the accounts of men in that state describe. Not triumph, just the sudden absence of the thing that had been trying to kill them. The engine idles, the wheat burns. Somewhere behind the line, a recovery crew is already logging the morning's losses, and this tank will go on the list to be pulled back and patched and sent forward again, because that is what the system does with wounded Shermans. The man inside it went to an aid station. The records near Mons don't follow him past that. Whether he kept the arm, went back to the yards, crewed another tank, or spent the rest of the war with a wrench, the file is empty on all of it. What the field carries is 2 hulls, one American, holed and running, one German, holed and burning. He rebuilt the first one himself. Then he used it to settle the ledger, 49,234. That's how many Sherman's American factories built. One burning hull in a wheat field near Mons doesn't move that number in any direction a German gunner could ever hope to feel. Reinhardt's morning kill, the one he wrote in pencil at breakfast, subtracted a single unit from a pool so deep it functioned less like an inventory than like weather. You don't shoot down a rainstorm. They show you the gun camera glory of the Panther and the Tiger, and they leave out the rest. The Germans built roughly 6,000 Panthers across the entire war. Total. Every variant, every factory, every month from 1943 to the end. The Americans built 8 times as many Shermans, and that was one tank on a menu that also ran to light tanks, tank destroyers, half-tracks, and the trucks that carried the fuel that made all of it move. The duel in the wheat field was, on paper, a fair fight. The war around it was never a fair fight, and both men in those 2 hulls were living inside that arithmetic, whether they understood it or not. Reinhardt understood the tactical math. His 75 could kill a Sherman at a range where the Sherman couldn't reliably kill him. On the day-to-day ledger of who penetrates whom at what distance, the German crew held the advantage, and the crews on both sides knew it down to the meter. What Reinhardt could not see was the replacement clock. Think about what a kill was supposed to accomplish. You destroy an enemy vehicle to remove it from the battlefield, permanently, or at least long enough to matter. That's the entire point of the exercise. A kill is a subtraction that's supposed to stay subtracted. The American system refused to let the subtraction stay subtracted. Belton Cooper's 3rd Armored Division is the cleanest illustration in the whole European theater. Over 11 months of combat, it was authorized around 232 medium tanks at any one time. Over those same 11 months, it lost, to all causes, more than 1,000 Shermans destroyed outright, and another 1,500 odd knocked out and recovered and returned to service. Do that math slowly. A single division burned through its entire tank strength, something like 15 times over, and never once stopped being a division. The line companies at the front barely felt the hemorrhage because the yards behind them were a transfusion that never ran dry. That's the number that beats the Panther. Armor thickness didn't do it, muzzle velocity didn't do it, and the quality of Krupp steel didn't do it. Recovery and replacement. 1,500 tanks knocked out and put back into the fight. Every one of those was a German kill that got unkilled by a welding arc and a parts truck. Every crew that wrote Sherman brewed up in a field book and moved on was, in a statistical sense, being lied to by the American logistics system, which had already decided that a knocked-out tank was a repair order rather than a result. The mechanic in the wheat field was the sharp end of that system, but the system didn't need him to be a hero. It needed him to be replaceable, and he was, and so was his tank, and so was Reinhardt's kill. That's the cruelty in the numbers. A German gunner could be better, and often was. His tank could be better, and often was. His crew could be better trained, better positioned, better at the pure craft of killing armor, and none of it reached the one place it needed to reach. Because behind every Sherman he destroyed stood a transporter with the next one, and behind that, a factory in Detroit, stamping out hulls faster than the Reich could build the shells to hold them. You cannot win a war of attrition against a country that has redefined attrition as a maintenance schedule. Reinhardt spent his morning doing everything right by the standards of his army. He acquired a target. He penetrated it. He confirmed the kill. He moved to the next threat. Textbook. And the tank he killed twice was, at that exact moment, being rearmed by the very man he'd wounded, because the machine had been built to come back and the man had been trained to bring it. The kill count was real. It just didn't count. In England, a British interrogator noted after listening to them for weeks, they cannot understand how they lost. He was writing about the German generals held at Trent Park, in a country house wired from the wine cellar to the attic with hidden microphones. The men inside thought they were among comrades. They played chess, walked the grounds, complained about the food, and talked, and every word ran down a wire to a listening room where refugee émigrés in headphones wrote it all down. What those men said, when they believed no enemy could hear them, is the closest thing we have to the truth as they understood it. They did not talk about American gunnery. That's the thing that stops you, going through the transcripts. These were professionals, men who had spent careers on the mathematics of penetration and defilade and the quality of optics. And when they sat in the dark and reasoned their way to the bottom of the defeat, they kept arriving at the same place, and it was not the battlefield. General der Panzertruppe, Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa, said it plainly in captivity. The Americans, he complained, simply had too much of everything, not better tanks, more of them, and more of the machinery to keep them running, and more of the fuel to move it all. It rankled him, the way losing to a richer man rankles a better card player. He had spent his life mastering a craft, and the craft turned out not to be the game. The foreign military studies sharpen it further, because those were written cold, on paper, for the Americans themselves. General after general, asked to explain the collapse, returned to the same word, Materialschlacht, The Battle of Materiel. Fritz Bayerlein, who had watched his Panzer division come apart under a sky owned by American aircraft and a front fed by American trucks, kept circling the same admission. German tactical skill was real, and it did not matter because it broke against a wall of production that no amount of skill could climb. Read enough of it, and a pattern surfaces that the generals themselves almost never named directly. They could say, "too much materiel," without flinching, because that credited the factory, an abstraction, a thing without a face. What they could not say, what almost none of them said, was the harder version of the sentence, that the tank they knocked out came back, that the kill they logged got erased by a man with a wrench. Admitting the enemy outproduced you is a wound to national pride. Admitting the enemy outrepaired you, that his mechanics quietly canceled your best gunnery night after night, is a wound to your pride as a soldier, and that one they mostly kept behind their teeth. One of them didn't. Buried in the wiretaps is a captured officer working through why the front never seemed to thin, no matter how many Shermans his crews burned, and arriving, out loud, at the answer. The Americans got their damaged tanks back into action, while a German wreck stayed a wreck. He said it the way a man says a thing he has only just understood and wishes he hadn't. Nobody in the room argued with him. This irritates me in a specific way, and I'll own it. The post-war histories in the West were largely written from these same German generals' accounts, and those men had every reason to explain their defeat as a matter of raw American tonnage rather than American cleverness. "We were buried under materiel," flatters the loser. It says the other side won by weight, not wit. It quietly writes Belton Cooper's mechanics out of the story, the men who made the tonnage count, and turns a triumph of engineering and organization into a mere accident of geography and coal. That framing survived for decades. It's wrong, and the men who invented it knew it was wrong. But that's a longer argument than this section can hold. Anyway, the point is what they conceded when they thought it was safe. Not that American soldiers shot straighter, that American factories and American workshops and the whole unglamorous apparatus behind the line had beaten them before the first round was ever fired in that wheat field. Von Thoma lost the war in a country house in England, at a chessboard, saying it out loud. He was right. He just had the reason slightly wrong. 9 seconds. That's roughly how long the round Reinhardt fired at breakfast spent doing its work. Flight, impact, penetration, the crew bailing, the smoke going up. 9 seconds to kill a Sherman. He was not wrong about any of it. The tank died the way he logged it, brewed up and abandoned, exactly the entry a gunner is trained to make. The mistake was never in the killing. The mistake was believing that a tank killed near Mons stayed dead, when the truth is that the machine he shot at was already immortal, and had been since before it rolled off a line in Detroit, or Lima, or Grand Blanc. They don't put this on the recognition charts. A Sherman was never one tank. It was a drawing, held in a filing cabinet, reproduced at 11 plants running 3 shifts. Chrysler alone put up a factory in Warren, Michigan, that did nothing but stamp out the things, and when the war ended, they turned it toward other work, and the drawing went into the vault. Kill the tank in the field, and you had killed a copy. The original was paper, and paper does not brew up. So Reinhardt's round did exactly what he intended, and changed nothing, because the thing he thought he was fighting, a finite enemy, a number you could grind down, did not exist. He was shooting at instances of an idea. The Reich fielded Panthers, the way a craftsman builds violins, each one a little different. Each one mourned when it burned. America fielded Shermans, the way a press prints newspapers. You do not grieve a newspaper. You print tomorrow's. The mechanic understood this in his hands before anyone put it in a report. He had patched the same kinds of holes 100 times. To him, a penetration was not a death. It was a Tuesday, a welding job, a track to retention, an engine to swap. The tank he crewed that morning had probably been somebody else's loss a month earlier, dragged back, cut open, rebuilt, and handed forward under a new bumper number. Ships of Theseus with a continental radial. The wound Reinhardt gave it went into the queue with all the others. The inversion runs like this. The German gunner spent the morning being right and losing, and the American mechanic spent it being wounded and winning, and neither of those outcomes had anything to do with courage or aim. They had to do with which country had decided years earlier that a tank was a consumable and a design was the only thing worth keeping. The generals at Trent Park half saw it. Von Thoma called it too much of everything. What none of them could quite say was that they had been fighting an enemy that could not be killed in the way soldiers understand killing, because its real body was never on the battlefield at all. It was in a filing cabinet in Michigan. The wheat field near Mons burned itself out by afternoon. The recovery crews came, as they always came, and the notes on what they hauled back that day do not single out one hull from another. The mechanic's tank, holed and running, would have gone into the same stream as every other casualty, inspected, sorted, sent to a yard, made ready. Whether it fought again that autumn or ended up as a parts donor, the paperwork near Mons doesn't say. Somewhere a bumper number was reassigned. That's the whole obituary. The First Army kept moving east that week. The maintenance battalions kept their lights on. Belton Cooper kept driving his clipboard of the dead up to the yard each night and driving back with tomorrow's runners. The war did not stop to notice what had happened in one field, because in the arithmetic that ran it, nothing unusual had happened at all. One tank down, one tank up, the ledger balanced by midnight. Reinhardt's field book, if it survived him, closed on a single pencil line that was accurate and meaningless in the same stroke. Sherman, brewed up. He killed it, and he killed it again, and both times it counted, and both times it didn't. 2 hulls in the wheat, 1 American tank, holed that morning and running by afternoon. 49,234 built, one of them dead by breakfast and back on the road before dark.